what role does gender play, and how does that change? Because obviously it seems from the beginning it's almost a complete reversal to what we have now. Is that entirely down to colonialism? Obviously, you alluded earlier that we internalize a lot of the Victorian attitudes ourselves, and as a result, we've kind of continued colonialism to a degree. But like, what role does gender play, and kind of what's happening during this period?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think I'll answer this based on I can speak most like the most detailed answer I can give is with regard to the Punjabi Hindus, mainly because there's a lot of discussion around gender in the and role of music when it comes to the Punjabi Hindus. And I'll speak about the Muslims and Sikhs also briefly, but mainly I think I mentioned Paluskar, who came from Maharashtra to Lahore, and he had this agenda for Hindu devotional music. Um, and I spoke of my Bhagwati, who wrote these songs, who repurposed the Sichniya. But I think the aim of Paluskar was to make sure that middle class, upper caste Hindu women would learn how to sing and would sing bhajans and pious songs in public. And the only way that these people thought they can lure or attract middle class women is by vilifying courtesans and vilifying mirasis and saying, oh, this is a Dev Vidya or, knowledge of God. And it's over time been sullied by these groups. Whereas, in fact, these were the groups who had kept it alive and, who were the possessors of this knowledge. And so you have women like Devki Sood, who becomes the first Punjabi woman to write a primer on music in Hindi from Amritsar in the 30s. So these are the kind of middle class women who then perform classical music and mostly connected to bhajan and temple context. So that becomes the kind of only context in which music is palatable, and especially for women to perform it. You have to show that you are married, middle class, pious woman if you want to perform in public, whether you perform bhajan or you perform classical music, right? So that becomes the defining parameters. And it's the only parameter in which women are legitimately allowed to perform. So that is the impact on gender. I mentioned earlier on how, moving to the Muslims, the only kind of real Punjab-related evidence I could find, and I'm sure we can find more, it's just that I didn't have time to finish it in 3.5 years of PhD research. The evidence was there was a very unique bill in 1940s called the Music at Muslim Shrines Bill. And the only purpose of this bill was to outlaw female singers and female dancers from Sufi shrines, because it was seen as women's presence. And one of the people who spoke in the Punjab Legislative Assembly was this was debated by Muslims mainly. And one of them, who was also a very deeply believing Muslim, he said, why don't we ban all musicians? Why do you want to keep the male musicians, but, throw out the female musicians? So he did raise that point. So again, gender becomes really important at this time. And that is tied to wider things, wider developments due to colonialism, which is a whole other story, right? So that's why this gender becomes deeply tied to music and performance of music. And in fact, there were debates on within how many miles radius can you allow female singers to be around the point. And then some people said, but if there's a wedding or a birth, people will invite courtesans to sing. You can't stop them from inviting them into their homes. So it was all these kinds of fascinating debates. And I think now we have, female kirtan singers coming out very visibly in many parts of the world, including in Indian Punjab. So it's growing now. There always were female Shabad singers, but again, it was less and muted. But I think it's now becoming more pronounced. So yeah, I think gender is definitely one of the most thorny issues when it comes to music and performance.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I'm not sure whether the rule is still enforced at Harmandir side, but they didn't used to let female musicians. So I think it may still be the case. I'm not quite sure. I don't know whether it's changed, but last time I checked, they weren't allowing. And again, it goes against every grain in the Sikh ethos, right? Like, as in, it makes no sense whatsoever. But again, it's a fact, or it was something. I think it's still the case. I'm hoping it's changed, but I haven't checked. So, like,
There
don't
have
hold me.
been some debates recently. I remember there was,
Yeah,
and then we debated on the harmonium. Certainly, I remember very
yeah,
recently.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess you already discussed how caste is being kind of almost re-owned, and it's being taken, like, it's almost, the identity is being almost taken in the hands of the people who it's being put on, rather than them allowing just to be labeled with it. They're almost defining it themselves. But you kind of briefly spoke about how a lot of these groups were almost castes in their own right. How does the role of caste impact then the development of music? Because obviously you've spoken just now about how it was turned by middle class women into something that was pious and rich, and given all of these kind of positive Christian virtues. What role does caste play? And I guess we know where it ends, with people kind of re-owning it and taking it on their own terms. But how does it start, and how does that develop?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think I'd be equipped to go back into time and say exactly how it started. But I think caste is such a. I mean, it's such a. It's sad, but it's such an organizing principle of life on the subcontinent. And I think, speaking of the Mirasis, they were not just musicians, they were storytellers. And more importantly, they were also genealogists. So they used to keep the family genealogies, and often they would be responsible for setting up matches, like connecting families on weddings. So they had all these specialized roles to play in the functioning of village life. Uh, and So they had these three roles, right? Storytellers, genealogists, and musician. And musician and storyteller went hand in hand. So the fact that they were genealogists tells you about how powerful their oral memory was. And South Asia has very strong oral traditions, and communities like the Mirasis are at the heart of, preserving that. And I guess that's what these colonial administrators recognized in going for the Mirasis and collecting some of their stories. Um, and I think but at the same time, like I said, while they recognized how powerful the Mirasis are, at the same time, they didn't give them any agency or any sort of real voice in the stuff they published. And in fact, colonial policy, as we know, re-entrenched and made caste hierarchies even worse. So, for example, if you had to stand for municipal elections in Lahore in 1890s, you could not belong to a so-called lower caste. So you couldn't belong to a Mirasi or a Chamar or a Butcher or a Kanjar or any of these castes. So in some senses, colonialism pandered to upper caste prejudices as well. And that kind of has percolated down. But of course, in India now we have, after 47 and, Dr. Ambedkar, there was this attempt to, of course, untouchability is illegal, but it's still quite hard to fight and erase caste prejudice at this very everyday level. So I think that's how I would answer the question on caste. Wife and not were not cast in the same way. So they, because the wife is a bit more open-ended as a category. You could be born into it. Your mother could be a tawaif. But equally, there could be people who could join the profession. So it was not as dominated by birth as, say, being born into Mirasi caste was. So this is how I would answer the question on how caste affects musicians. Yes.
So is that, I guess, why then in the modern day people often say that one of Maharaj Ranjit Singh Ji's wives was a Ganjar, and they imply it in the derogatory sense because she comes from that. Yeah, and they don't say it about the wife that came from the wife, because obviously to them that's okay.
It's been clubbed together, and the clubbing together happened with colonial policy. So there were all these Contagious Diseases Acts where all public women, whether they were elite Tawaif or a more common Kanjari, would be labeled together as one. And the difference would not be appreciated. And Tawaif's knowledge of high literature, because Tawaif would be well versed in poetry, or in poetry, and very literate. They were a literate community. That's the other thing. What we do find is, if you look at Dr. Lakener's report on education in colonial Punjab, he noted that even the most common dancing girl has some knowledge of writing, reading and writing. So again, these were women who were traditionally the ones allowed to read and write. So gender is really interesting because middle class women and upper caste women were for the longest time not allowed to read and write as well. So I think it kind of, these groups like Tawaif and Kanjri, when you look at their history, it opens up a reflection on wider social prejudice as well, doesn't it?